Hi folks, welcome to Some of Each, episode 11, Time. So Some of Each, in which I read to you from some fiction, some poetry, and some children's lit on a specific theme. And of course this week's theme is time, and more broadly, clocks, and time. So I'm going to start us out with this young adult novel, although I think it's for people of all ages. Some of you may recognize it because it was made into a movie, but it's called The Invention of Hugo Cabret by Brian Selznick. And what you need to know, I'm going to read to you chapter 2, but what you need to know is that it's about a boy named Hugo, who's an orphan, who lives by himself in a Paris train station and tends to all of the clocks. And of course, then there's many adventures that befall him. So this was made into a movie, as I was saying, but it is also filled with amazing illustrations, which I will try to show to you. They're these lovely black and white illustrations. We'll see how they do. I'm going to read to you from chapter 2, The Clocks. Hugo ran down the hallway and disappeared back inside the metal vent in the wall. He paused for a moment. The air was cool and damp. A few dim light bulbs provided a tiny bit of illumination inside the dark passageways. The pictures really tell some of the story in some of these chapters. Give you at least a flavor of them. Pretty cool. Hugo opened the door and let himself inside. Above the ceiling of the main waiting area, there was a cluster of secret apartments that had been built for the people who ran the train station years ago. Most of them had long been abandoned. Only one was still in use. Some sunlight filtered through the dirty skylight. Hugo looked at the rows and rows of jars filled with pieces from all the toys he had stolen from the toy booth over the past few months. The jars sat on shelves made from scavenged planks he had found inside the walls of the station. Under his rickety bed lay a pile of Hugo's drawings. His deck of cards rested on a dusty trunk in the middle of the room. Nearby, on a small table, was a stack of envelopes, his uncle's uncashed paychecks, accumulating week by week. Hugo wiped his eyes and picked up his bucket of tools. He stuffed some more matches and candles into his pockets and set to work. As usual, Hugo headed first to the big glass clocks on the roof, because they were the hardest to reach. They were like huge round windows and looked out over the city, one facing north and one facing south. Hugo had to climb up a long, dark staircase and slither through an opening in the ceiling at the top of the ladder to get inside them. During the day, his eyes always stung for a few moments from the flood of light through the glass. The motors and gears of these clocks were the biggest in the station, and Hugo was often afraid that his hand was going to get caught. In the corner of the room, attached by ropes, hung huge weights that kept the clocks running. He checked the time on the glass clocks against the time on his uncle's railroad watch, which he kept with his tools and wound diligently every morning. He then took a moment to carefully look the whole mechanism over and added a few drops of oil to each gear shaft from a little oil can in his kit. Hugo's head tilted slightly to the side as he listened to the beat of the clock, waiting until he was sure the machine was running correctly. Once he had finished with the clocks on the roof, he climbed down the ladder and the long staircase. Back inside the dark passageways, he checked the other clocks in the station, all of which were made of brass and could be maintained from inside the walls. Hugo lit his candles to help him see and began with the clock that overlooked the ticket booths. This clock, like all the others, had weights too, but much smaller ones which disappeared into the floor. Hugo attached a crank to the back of the clock and, using all of his strength, turned it as far as it would go. Hugo then made sure the gears and levers were moving accurately, and he checked that the time was correct on the miniature dial built into the back of the clockworks. Next, he moved through the hidden passageways to the ring of clocks around the train platforms, and then to the backs of the smaller clocks that faced the interior offices, including the station inspectors. Looking through the numbers, Hugo could see the station inspector's desk, and in the corner of the office, the cage of a small jail cell that sat waiting for any criminals caught in the station. Hugo had seen men and women locked up in there, and a few times he'd even seen boys no older than himself in the cell, their eyes red from crying. Eventually, these people were taken away, and Hugo never saw them again. From the offices, Hugo followed a long, hidden tunnel to the back of the clock opposite the old man's toy booth. He wished he could avoid this clock, but he knew he couldn't skip any of them. Peering out through the numbers, Hugo spied the old man again, alone in his toy booth at the end of the hallway, looking through the pages of Hugo's notebook. Hugo wanted to scream out, but he didn't. He oiled the clock and listened to it carefully. He could tell it wouldn't need to be wound for another day or two. So Hugo kept going until all 27 clocks in the station had been attended to, just the way his uncle had taught him. So that's just a little flavor of The Invention of Hugo Cabret by Brian Selznick. The book is a completely different experience than the movie, so I recommend them both. All right, so next I'm going to read to you some poetry. And I'm going to start out with two poems by a friend of mine, Endi Bogue Hartigan, who I went to Reed College with. We were there together writing creative theses. She's a brilliant poet, and her new manuscript that isn't out yet is a book that deals with clocks and time. And so I'm going to read to you a couple of the poems from that manuscript that are available online that have been published in journals. So this one was in the Bennington Review. It's called More a Clothespin. The cuckoo, more a plug in time, a jab, proclaiming itself at half-hour intervals. More a clothespin than a bird, a notch of wood dipped in yellow, yelling melodic chime, more a punctuating clothespin, more insertion and emotion. More a temporal voting season, a proclamation, claiming midweek love or fiscal haunt or sunrise leak, and seeing the gears through every and each alarm. More a cuckoo than a thought, more a tree line than a gear. More an approximation of myself, pronoun making, minute staking, more a filament of the melodic cuckoo ticking earth. Here the ever clock of clothespins, chime of when we were healthier, when we were perched like birds on a Monterey pier, when we heard of the towers, chime of when we were not astir. Over and over the local crimes and chimes, when terror was less a word. Oh, clock, oh, children of clothespins. When they were 5, they would run to the cuckoo chime, whatever they were doing, scramble up the couch to see its yellow notch emerge. More the song and unsung minutes, more when and when so porous it hurts. More cost of porousness, the scent of loss in certain t-shirts. More, I am the cuckoo bird, retreating, claiming 2 notes only, I or we, true or here, 5-year or forever, escapement or dear. Back to the impossible filament of self we thought we were rid of, but then the alarm, the daily lever, and who wakes beside whose ears, here in this Tuesday, far from never. So that was More a Clothespin by Endi Bogue Hartigan, and I'm going to read you one more of her poems from that manuscript. This one was published in Interim magazine, and it's called The Longest Hour is the Shortest. The longest hour is the shortest, too, where you are merely an eye, ant time, circle construction. In the longest hour, there was wet ant pedal, fiddle panic, another American number. Unimaginable shootings occurred every several days, and the hour absorbed them. The longest hour, a crack in time, large headlines. The longest hour, a nesting doll in which smaller hours arose out of the flowered tight belly of the hour with complete, specific lives. Whose thin-skinned nasturtium, whose sister, whose license, absorb, I can't remember the hour exactly, only hours that nested or from it. Whose Headline ligature, petal wrinkled, last word. I cleaned to absorb what I hadn't heard, how I can admire the ant's industry, then mop its route industriously. What an hour is to an ant, what a second is to an automatic weapon. 20 dead, 12 dead, shooter dead, nauseous reading. What grief is through a list, what an hour is to God's kiss. The longest hour made headlines into eruptions, made strangers into cousins. May we love all strangers more. Hello, wet nasturtium, larger headlines. So that's The Longest Hour is the Shortest by Endi Bogue Hartigan. So I'm really looking forward to when that book comes out. It's all clocks and time and politics. All right, so a few more poems for you. I'm going to read you a poem from one of my very favorite poets, Sharon. This is my favorite book of hers, The Dead and the Living. This one's a little bit different take on time. This one has to do with aging. It's called 3510. Brushing out my daughter's dark silken hair before the mirror, I see the gray gleaming on my head, the silver-haired servant behind her. Why is it just as we begin to go, they begin to arrive? The fold in my neck clarifying as the fine bones of her hips sharpen. As my skin shows its dry pitting, she opens like a small pale flower on the tip of a cactus. As my last chances to bear a child are falling through my body, the duds among them, her full purse of eggs, round and firm as hard-boiled yolks, is about to snap its clasp. I brush her tangled, fragrant hair at bedtime. It's an old story, the oldest we have on our planet, the story of replacement. That's 3510 from Sharon from The Dead and the Living. All right, so now I'm going to read you a longish poem by Adamshick, who's a local here in the Pacific Northwest. This is his book, Saint Friend, and I'm going to read you one poem from this. Also a different take on time. This one is called Layover. They keep paging Kenneth Koch at the airport. Someone should let the announcer know he is dead, that there is no city he can go to, that no one is expecting him. Once I applied to be a horse. The mirror of night had shed its clothes, and I needed to be something that mattered. I needed to scrape my brown flank against the bark of a ponderosa. My friends have moved away. They sleep in places I've never been. And here we are. It's the most miraculous thing. We walk over counterweighted bridges in love with snow tumbling through their lights. The terminal's long glass walls dark at this hour. I feel we live similar lives, only the time zone and language different. In the cab on the way, I saw what was real and humane in front of a pub. A bicycle leaning against a thin trunk, lights strung in trees reflected in shop windows. I loved the way they loved out there at dusk. Tables littered with wallets and phones, hats, a beer divided between two glasses, someone showing someone a new shirt, sheltered in the camber of voices. I thought nothing will ever be easier or better. We will not rise. It is too late. The year we write on our checks, too high to ever expect anything to be different. We will always live here, ancient and new. There are the people we are. These are the people we are. Saint Friend, carry me when I am tired and carry yourself. Let's keep singing the songs we don't live by. Let's meet tomorrow. We don't have to wait until the holidays. The distance is long, but it is nothing. Remember when we lived together, when we kissed, when we talked about fog on the morning lake and the markings we wanted on our graves? The city is lit. I'm up in the air. It is yes until I die. And when I die, I want to be paged once a day in an airport somewhere on this earth, so people will think I am just running late or lost, will think I am in transit, sad about the last embrace or sad to leave the city of snow and bridges or eager to land, to walk the small wooden streets of my house. One city, once a day. I wish that for everyone. An unknown elegy briefly filling the ears of strangers. I picture my friends dead nightly because I can't see them, because I can't hear them. I want to love them enough. I want to dress the wound of their absence enough. I thought I would be the dead one, stretched out on the coffin of my bed, the white bull come to mourn one of its disciples. Its head of 14 stars. But my body keeps telling me it's my friends who have vanished, that they will no longer up $1 for a few pints of porter or stand in a kitchen full of words and laughter. I tell my body I will keep their memories, and my body says they will be anchors. Then I will collect their shadows, and my body says, you are not a reliquary. Their eyes are stitched shut, their mouths are stitched shut, and all the verbs surrounding their names are dead verbs. I don't want to hold my body. I don't want to hold my body or listen to it. From above, the clouds of Stockholm are a tilled white field, and from below they are a low gathering of gray, letting go their misery. Tomorrow I see the Vasa, a ship inlaid with so much gold it sank a few meters into its journey. It was raised from the water some 330 years after its descent into the silt, and had a museum built around it. The voyage sallied forth in all its beauty and finally became a treasure. Just like your life or mine, with its quiet dark room holding a golden boat. A destination different than expected. So many paths, so many apologies, so much gratitude. Luggage rides the carousel, turning with a repetitive clank. The floor shines like a museum's. Art often seems a kind of funeral. The important things we leave. I half expect to see bouquets under the paintings. I never much believed in the muse, never much believed my belief was carried too far out into the world. In the gallery, doesn't everything speak to relations? Hasn't everything always spoken to relations, to the smallest gesture? Let the muse make whatever needs to be made. Let the muse tend the fire. Your whole body is curled like an ear I wanted to talk into all evening. Your hand a ring of articulated keys. I want that moment when we climb down the bright ladder of ecstasy, when our breath comes back, when everything is alive, present in the moment, with nothing to wait for, nothing to worry over, only the need to rise into the beauty that is. The folded clothes, the interior of a suitcase with its personal logic being carried on elevators and escalators, the moving walkway. Being alone in a theater and seeing the latch, handle, and the old stickers stuck on the leather helping the narrative along. Then an open umbrella floating on the park's pond, the screen holding all that blue light. I always thought death would be like traveling in a car, moving through the desert, the earth a little darker than the sky at the horizon, that my life would settle like the end of a day and I would think of everyone I ever met, that I would be an invisible passenger, quiet in the car, moving through the night forever, with the beautiful thought of home. Like when my mother calls from the far side of history saying, "Honey, everything brings everything back." A red-barked tree applauds the day. Summer is warm and light so late. The bruise which was hers, the map she folded and gave to me. I think of her in the quiet house. In her death, I see her eyes closed in prayer. Her hand that was never a star. Her foot that was kissed but never a bridge. Her heart that was never anything but a heart. I see her smoking her first cigarette, hip and shoulder against brick. I see her laughing in the blue car as it crosses the border. I touch a picture of my brother, born in early February. I remember the dream where she held a stone like a book of fables. I see the year of my birth. My mouth searching for her body. She often says, "Stars are cheap glass held in burnt tinfoil, space the unliked cousin to nothingness." I spent my life avoiding my life. It's easier than you might think. Time is a younger sister hiding her anger. I don't want to hold my body, the minor keys, or the dissonant chords. There is a space in here for you. There is more time than you can imagine. The purple tulips buck in the wind as if their white roots were a cavalry marching. Approaching the mountain, they are swallowed first by its shadow, then by its mystery. I'm confident there are different ways to think within my own thinking. One illustration of this is to look at a handful of bubbles from a bath. Across the concourse, a plane comes to a stop at gate F7. Soon, people will come through the door at the end of the hall. It's one thing 1 second, another thing another second. The chess clock counts 47 minutes before a rook is moved 1 square to the left. It's in the way you listen to the outward flow of another's resistance and to your own. You cannot lie. Each person watches the same accretion. None of us language, none of us silent to the way days happen. The blunt head of a pawn is struck in the mesh of pieces, in the beautiful contention to survive. Sun warms the window, half the globe. Wind pushes through trees clustered with acorns. Cars line the gray-pocked street. It's so peaceful at 11 a.m. I understand light as a thing we breathe. Last week, the doctor let me use the otoscope to look into her ear. Hidden in the hollow, I saw a small, cataracted eye, an eye not meant to see or be seen, translating everything that comes to it. Like my mother, I don't know how to live. If only I could travel fast enough and far enough to see what has happened. The evening is trying to slip through a seam in the horizon. The moment I believe bats sleep in their caves like a dying black flyer, I know I've begun my walk back to the beginning. So that's Layover from Carl Adamshick from St. Friend. Thanks for sticking with that one. I know long poems can be hard to listen to, but that one's so brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to read you 2 of my own poems now before we move on to the last piece of the evening. So these are both from my daughter's manuscript, which, for those who don't know, is a series of persona poems in the voices of daughters of various characters from mythology and folklore and pop culture and all sorts of things. So I'm going to read you 2 daughters. This is Clockmaker's Daughter. This is why I like to open things once alive. What is the body but a clock of our being, how we measure day against night, or number the turns of our flesh? When my father leans over his workbench, gears laid out amidst the threaded screws, I am there next to him, assembling the bones of a mouse. Crickets chime to mark the dusty hours, and birds declare the summiting dawn. The wheelwork, plied by my father's skill, is synchronized to their unfailing calls. Today, I am dissecting a fish, its lovely scales reflected in my scalpel, gills spread by my forceps to inspect this miracle of breath. Sequence of ribs thin as second hands. My father's truing caliper is not so different, fashioning intricacies of brass and steel, or his peen hammer to flatten and forge. What he builds is an echo of what tick-tocks beneath all of our skins. This bird, this wasp, riveted to the perfect mechanics of wings. These hands I use to cleave, his hands on the piercing saw. The hands we make, what we can make with our hands. That's Clockmaker's Daughter. And this one is Time Traveler's Daughter. It's completely annoying. My mother says things like, "You shouldn't go out with him. It's not going to end well." "I'm just trying to keep you from heartbreak, honey. I'm using my power for good. You should be thanking me." "Maybe you could get us a woman president," I tell her, instead of meddling with the high school dating scene. She gives me that disappointed look, the one that means I'll never understand. "I'm working on it," she says. "It's complicated." She never takes me along, claims it's not good for my developing brain. "Mom," I say, "if my mind can wrap around Euclid and Einstein, it can probably handle hanging out with your 1980s big-haired friends watching MTV. Sometimes she says things like, "Maybe I should take you back so you'll appreciate your cell phone and the internet and cars that run on French fry oil." "Whatever," I tell her. "Bring me back a pterodactyl egg and I'll stop asking." But I know it's not like that. She can't bring anything with her. If she could, my dad would be here now, helping me with my physics homework, taking me out on clear nights to watch the stars. She won't admit she visits him, but I know. Instead, I watch her disappear over and over. Hope she'll survive her wormhole again. Hope all her atoms are still her. Mom, I ask, what are you fixing? She says, time's not like that, honey. Not like a needle and thread. Not something that mends. That's Time Traveler's Daughter. So Daughters will be out next year, next September, from Airlie Press. So last, I'm going to end with a little classic fairy tale-ness. I'm going to read you a section of Sleeping Beauty. All right, this is in a great edition that's illustrated by Arthur Rackham, but I'm just going to read you a small piece. This is chapter 10. I'm assuming you all know the story, so you can pick up right where we're going to start. And now, as the prince drew nearer, he could see that the story he had heard about that terrible place was true. For held in the tangle of briar were the bones of many unhappy young men who had tried to force their way through to the castle. Rags and tatters of their finery hung upon the great thorns that pointed menacingly like sharp claws. Here and there upon the ground beneath lay pieces of rusty armor, a helmet surrounded by a coronet of gold that once had belonged to a king's son, a shield with a prince's device, a sword with jewel-encrusted hilt worth a king's ransom. There they lay, all disregarded among the blanched bones upon the grass, and the ground ivy spread out its leaves to cover them. Not a sound broke the deep and awful silence. No bird sang, no insect droned. There was no scurry of woodland creatures among the leaves, no sigh of wind in the trees. In all that place only the thorn hedge seemed threateningly alive, waiting to destroy the intruder who should attempt to force the secret it guarded. Who would blame the prince if for a moment his heart had almost failed him? There was no gap in that hedge, and the great thorns were sharp as dagger blades to stab his flesh. But if the prince hesitated, it was not for long. Have I come so far to turn back now, he thought. These others who have died were brave men, and though they failed, with a courage as great as theirs, I may succeed. And without wasting another moment, the prince began to force his way through the hedge. And now he noticed with surprise that those thorns which looked so sharp and cruel became soft as thistledown, and soon as he touched them, and the trailing bramble branches did not entangle him, but bent aside at his touch, as though they had been stems of grass. The hedge opened before him, and as he went through it, pink blossoms of wild roses bloomed on the branches until the tangled wall became a mass of flowers. At last, the prince found himself on the other side of the hedge in the gardens of the castle. Before him he could see the high towers and turrets bathed in the fresh light of the morning sun, and as he hastened towards them, he noticed that the gardens were as trim and tidy as though they had just been tended by the gardeners. There was no moss or weed upon the smooth paths. The turf on the lawns was as short and firm as though it had just been mown, and in the flower beds everything was in the most careful order. Spring flowers were blooming there, but they had bowed their heads upon their stalks, and even the trees seemed to hang their arms as though asleep. Everywhere there was the same deep silence. The air, which should have been full of the twittering of birds, was heavy and languorous. There was no flutter of butterfly wings or darting of flies. The fountains on the lawns were not playing, and as the prince glanced over the edge of the marble basin of one of them, he could see the goldfish beneath the water lily leaves, lying still, with never a wave of the tail or flicker of fin. So he went on over the lawns and terraces, and never a waking thing did he see. But when he came to the courtyard, he saw a soldier standing there, leaning on his pike with his head bent upon his chest. At first the prince thought that he was dead, but his cheek was fresh and ruddy, and it was quite plain to see that he was merely asleep. In the courtyard itself were other human forms, all still and silent. A row of pikemen leaned against the wall, and in front of them, stretched out upon the ground, snored the sergeant, who had been drilling them when the spell came upon the castle. A young squire, with a sleeping hawk upon his wrist, slept leaning against a sleeping horse which he had been about to mount. Nearby lay a page with a hound in leash, both sleeping as soundly as though they never would wake, and through a window in the stables the prince saw a groom lying with straw in his mouth. In the stables themselves, a like condition of things prevailed. The horses slept at their stalls with their noses to the mangers, standing on their 4 legs, just as they were when they were enchanted 100 years before. And on the back of one of them sat the stable cat. Here and there upon the ground lay grooms and ostlers, fast asleep among the straw. From the stables the prince made his way to the great kitchen, where he saw equally strange sights, and he could not help smiling when he came upon the cook, with her hand still outstretched to clout the head of the unhappy scullion whom she had by the ear. Before the fires hung the spitted partridges and fowls that were cooking for the princess's birthday feast, and at the table a maid had fallen asleep with her hands in a large trough full of dough. She had been making the pastry for a pie when the sleep fell upon her, and by her side was another maid who had been plucking a black hen. At the sink a kitchen knave was leaning over the pot he had been scouring. Then the prince went out to the great hall and saw the courtiers asleep in the window alcoves or stretched out upon the polished floor. Everywhere was a silence so profound that the prince was almost alarmed to hear his own breathing, and the beating of his heart sounded like a muffled drum. On and on he went, through rooms and corridors, up staircases and down staircases, into the queen's chamber, where he saw the queen and her ladies as still and silent as the rest. One of those ladies had been reading to the queen at the moment when the charmed sleep fell upon the castle, and the book, A History of Troy, still lay open on her lap. Then the prince went into the king's room, where his majesty sat with his ministers of state round the council board. He almost lingered there, for it was very curious to see those nobles as quiet and motionless as though they had been waxworks in a show. Some of them were frowning as though in deep thought, and some smiling as though they had suddenly remembered something clever to say. The king himself at the head of the council table had evidently fallen asleep in the very midst of a speech, for his arm lay outstretched on the table with pointing finger, and by his side his secretary's finger still held the pen with which he was inscribing on a roll of parchment the royal words. So the prince hurried through the castle from top to bottom until he had glanced into every room and opened every door. And still he knew that there was something more to see, for nowhere had he come across the sleeping princess. Many maidens he had seen of surpassing beauty, but his heart told him that none of them all was the maiden whom he had come to awaken. Down he went into the courtyard again and found another stairway which led to the battlements. There stood the watchman whose duty it was to look out over the country and report the arrival of travelers, but they too were all asleep, though one of them had his horn in his hand as though he had been about to blow it when he was suddenly overcome by the charm slumber. From the battlements the prince climbed in turn into each of the turrets, but there was nothing in them at all, and no living thing except the owls asleep in the crevices of the walls and the bats that hung head downwards from the rafters. Now only one small turret remained to be explored. It was the oldest of the turrets, almost a ruin and plainly long unused, for the iron door was rusty and the ivy trailed about the walls. The prince approached it with a beating heart, for there he knew he should find what he sought. He threw open the creaking door. With impatient feet he mounted the crazy winding stair, opened the door at the top, and entered a little dark room. And then he started forward with the cry of joy and wonder, for lying on the couch below the narrow window he saw the princess. She was lying upon a couch, with her lovely hair spread out like a stream of gold, and oh, no words can tell how beautiful she was. Softly the prince came near and bent over her. He touched her hand. It was warm, as if in life, but she did not stir. No sound of breathing came from her parted lips, fresh and sweet as the petals of a rose. Her eyes were closed. For a long time the prince stood and gazed upon her, for never in all his life had he seen a maiden so lovely. Then suddenly he bent down and kissed her lips. That was the end of the enchantment. The princess's eyelids quivered. Languidly she moved her head and stretched out her arms. Her eyes opened and she smiled. "Is it you, my prince?" she said. "How long you have kept me waiting." So that, of course, is a scene from Sleeping Beauty. So tonight we heard Sleeping Beauty. We heard a couple of my poems from Daughters. We heard from Adamshick from Saint Friend, Sharon Olds from The Dead and the Living, a couple of poems by my friend Endi Bogue Hartigan from her book that will be out soon about clocks and time. And of course, we heard from the adventures of Hugo Cabret from Brian Selznick. So if you liked what you heard tonight, I will hope that you will order the books online from your local bookstore, pick them up curbside, or have them delivered and support them during this time. Thank you so much for tuning in for Some of Each, episode 11, Time, and I'll see you next time. Good night.